Okay, I will continue my yesterday's lecture on suicide. We had started discussing etiology called egoistic suicide. According to Durkheim, this etiology of suicide results from lack of integration of the individual into society or social solidarity. According to Durkheim, the stronger the forces throwing the individual onto his own resources, the greater the suicide rate in the society in which this occurs. Now, I need not remind you that Durkheim's concept of suicide is broader than the English language term civil society, and it not only includes civil society, but it also includes nation state, military establishment, and the market. Therefore, he is not talking about only the civil society and the rate of higher or lower suicide occurrences in the civil society of France or Western Europe. Rather, he is making a general statement which covers all four elements of society or social solidarity. Okay. Now, he is making the first theoretical proposition. According to Durkheim, the first category is religious society. And please remember, he is not using the term religious community or religious institutions. He is talking about religious society at par with the civil society or military society or the society of the nation state or the market. I am repeating, among the religious society, the suicide rate is lowest among the Catholics. The Catholics closely integrates the individual into the collective life. In contrast, the Protestant societies all over the world, based on the data Durkheim was using in this book, primarily gathered, classified, and analyzed by his two research assistants. The main person is Marcel Mauss. Therefore, in the book Suicide, Durkheim acknowledges that all the tables of suicide rate and their variations is a contribution of Marcel Mauss and his team. Now you know that both of them, the uncle and the nephew, wrote one book together. The name of the book is Primitive Classification. And then Marshall Moss had also independent books. The celebrated The Gift is most notable, but he also collaborated with Henry Hubert on a book based on Indian data. It is known as Sacrifice. Now, the English term sacrifice doesn't connote the cultural meaning. He is primarily referring to yajna of the Hindus. Now, yajna is certainly not a sacrifice, because sacrifice in the English term is related with examples like animal sacrifice or sacrifice of the daughter when she is given in gift in the form of kanyadan. Okay, but at the moment, both the Durkheimian analysis and the Mossian data is stating that, in contrast to the Catholic societies, the Protestant societies have higher suicide rate, and it is correlated with the high rate of individualism. Now, what is individualism? A political creed or political ideology which emerged in a milieu dominated by instrumental rationality and religious psychology, which is utilitarian in outlook towards the life, other people, market, state, nature, and meaning of life. This was an explanation of individualism in this context. Making the statement again so that there is no confusion between the explanation of individualism and the higher rate of suicide among the Protestant societies. The Protestant societies have high suicide rate, and it is correlated with the high rate of individualism. Individualism I have already explained. The advancement of science and knowledge and accompaniment of the secularization process under Protestantism. The common ideological semantic thread among the Protestant societies. Now, some of you get confused when you encounter the term secular. Now, the contrast of secular is sacred. The contrast of secular is sacred. And what is secular? It is profane. It is related with the individual. It is against the collective interest of the society at large. And what it is in reality? The term secular means that consciously or subconsciously you are following the religion of the Protestant societies. And 99% of Indians, including the students of sociology, since the time of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, have been living in megalomania and delusion that secular is something which is not rooted in religion. Therefore, when your demagogues or politicians call you to vote for a secular candidate, he or she is requesting you to convert into Protestant religion. Now, whether this is justified or not is a value judgment which, as a Buddhist sociologist, I never make. Okay. Therefore, in case there is a higher rate of suicide among a certain sections of Indian society, for example, in IITs or IIMs, or in the cash crop region of modern agricultural farming, namely cash crop, it is not only a question of intrusion of high technology, which is an element of forces of productions according to Karl Marx, but it is also rooted in the alienation of the individual from his community bond, including family, the village community, the urban community, or whatever. Therefore, advancement of science and knowledge in third world of Talcott Parsons, or developing countries of the post-colonial theorists, take a partial view of modern science, because the advancement of science and technology is rooted in a culture of technology which is supposed to be rooted in the secular culture. It means a culture which has emerged out of the Protestant Reformation of Christianity in 16th century Europe, but with the colonization of the industrially advanced nations, this Protestant ideology was advocated as the modern outlook or the secular outlook, which is nothing but the Protestant outlook which Max Weber talks about in his book. And lay suicide of Durkheim, based on the Maussian data, here Maussian data includes Marcel Mauss and his teammates who collected the massive data of suicide rate prevalent when the book was being written in 1897. The Protestants explains, now grammatically this is wrong because Protestants is a plural, and in plural we use explained and not explains. But in the original book it is written like this. Therefore, I will not correct the grammar, I will try to convey the sociological connotation. Because here they are trying to explain the suicide of an individual, and they are trying to explain the suicide rate. Therefore, here means an individual who commits suicide in Protestant societies, where there is a main Protestant group and then there are followers, primarily the followers in the colonies, the collaborators with the Protestant empires in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, those who are regarded as great agents of modernization and scientific culture. The Protestants explain, in original explains, the Protestants explain the universe as well as man in the universe in purely instrumental, rational, and utilitarian terms, and promotes a collective feeling of disenchantment. Durkheim claims that Protestant belief system promotes disintegration of the tide of the individual to the group. Durkheim said, and I am quoting in direct narration, Protestant belief or secular belief, he equates secular with the Protestant. The Protestant belief system promotes disintegration of the tide of the individual to the group, in bracket, umbilical cord. Umbilical cord is garbhanal. You know, when a child is born from the womb of the mother, there is umbilical cord which ties the navel of the child with the cord of the mother, which emanates from the womb. According to contemporary molecular biology, usually this umbilical cord is destroyed in most societies, but in case it is preserved, it has the potential to cure all diseases of the individual. But let me not take this question of umbilical cord. Let us come to Durkheimian theory of suicide rate among the Protestant societies. I am quoting it again. Protestant belief system promotes disintegration of the tide of the individual to the group and shows up in a higher suicide rate. Then he is claiming that egoistic suicide is highly correlated with slight integration of the individual into family life. Therefore, he is making 3 points that the higher rate of suicide among the Protestant societies, conscious or unconscious, this is my explanation, is related with, until now, 3 important aspects. One is a collective feeling of disenchantment. which is the social function in Robert Merton's terminology of a purely instrumental, rational and utilitarian worldview. And second, a collective feeling of disenchantment is the first main cause or reason of a higher rate of egoistic suicide in Protestant societies. The second is Protestant belief system promotes disintegration of the tide of the individual and shows up in higher suicide rate. What is the second point? First is collective feeling of disenchantment. The second is disintegration of the tie of the individual to the group. And third, egoistic suicide is highly correlated with slight integration of the individual into family life. In other words, until now he is presenting three indexes of egoistic suicide. Egoistic suicide will take place in that society dominated by Protestant ideology, which suffers from three collective indicators. One, a collective feeling of disenchantment. Two, disintegration of the tie of the individual to the group. Third, looser or slighter integration of the individual into family life. In other words, where family values are not very strong, as in Western Europe and the developed countries of the New World, including United States of America and the countries of the Third World, family values are a great insurance against a high suicide rate. Then he said, he means Émile Durkheim, the individual characteristics of the spouses, husband and wife, the individual characteristics of the spouses is unimportant. Therefore, you cannot accuse that in case a person would have married to a better spouse, he or she would not have committed suicide. Durkheim says this is bullshit, nonsense. The individual characteristics of the spouses is unimportant. Suicide rate is dependent upon the structure of the family and the roles played by its members. You can see that this paragraph is the foundation of French structuralism of Claude Lévi-Strauss. What is the structural view about the individual or any individual action? According to Lévi-Strauss, not only the individual members of a society, but also individual words in a grammatical sentence have no innate meaning for social purpose. What does it mean? The term love or hate has no innate meaning independent of the structural relationship of these words, love or hate, with other words in the sentence. Therefore, sentence has meaning. According to Levi-Strauss, words do not have any meaning. Here you can equate the words with the individual or the husband or the wife or the labor or the capitalist. The individual characteristics, Durkheim said, of the spouses or the elements is unimportant. Suicide rate is dependent upon the structure of the family and the roles played by its members. Then Durkheim comes to the second aspect or the second example or the examples from a second aspect of society, that is political and national communities within the solidarities. First, he was referring to religion, and within religion he referred to family, and then he contextualized the higher or lower suicide rate. Now he is discussing political and national communities. Durkheim said, in great crisis, suicide rate falls. In great crises, the suicide rate falls because then society is more strongly integrated and the individual participates actively in social life. His egoism is restricted and his will to live strengthened. Here we are coming to the fourth index of egoistic suicide. And what is that? At least egoistic suicide will decrease the rate of egoistic suicide will be less. It will decrease when there is a national crisis or political crisis. Now, later on you will understand that although in crisis, great political and national crisis, egoistic suicide will be decreasing. You know, it will be less, it will be restricted, but I am telling you in advance, anemic suicide, another etiology of suicide, anemic suicide may increase, but at the moment we are not dealing with anemic suicide etiology, rather we are restricting our discussion only to egoistic suicide. Therefore, the fourth index of higher or lower suicide rate is the situation of normal and pathological in political and national communities. Now, war, for example, between France and England during the Napoleonic era saw an index of lower suicide rate because the war was a national crisis. It was a political crisis. And during the war between two nations, there is a higher rate of national sentiment which integrates the individual with the group, at least during the war or the emergency of India in 1975. Therefore, try to understand the analytical difference between enemy, which I will discuss later on, and the political crisis. Political crisis in any normal solidarity up to a particular extent is normal, following the rules of sociological method of Émile Durkheim. He said a particular percentage of crime is normal for a society. Therefore, war is not necessarily abnormal for many groups in the world. Rather, it is an opportunity to show their national sentiment since ancient times. Then Durkheim discusses lower societies. Now he is not discussing lower class, he is discussing lower society. What he meant by lower societies? Please do not make a guess. I am reading out his sentence in direct narration. He said about suicide rate among the lower societies, he said that in such societies, there is comparatively greater integration of the individual in society. And then he complements it by saying, among lower societies, the individual's life is rigorously governed by custom and habit. What does it mean? By lower societies, he is referring to societies which are unindustrialized, which are less urbanized, which are less developed in the sense of Protestant theologians. In other words, he is referring to pre-industrial tribal societies and other societies where the ties of community sentiment is very strong. Therefore, he is referring to Russia. When in 1897, he includes among lower societies like Russia, China, India, South Africa, almost all countries of Africa, excluding some sections of South Africa, and almost all countries of Latin America. He said that these are lower society. Now, the lower society in English is a very bad translation of the word he used in the French. He said mechanical solidarity, which I think is much more familiar to you. By lower societies, he meant mechanical solidarities. Now, the discussion about egoistic suicide ends, and in the second he deals with altruistic suicide, but in between there is a discussion which becomes very important. It can be called as the liminal section. I think most of you may not be familiar with this term liminal, Liminal. What is liminal? Liminal is a stage which is blurred in social memory, or in geography it will be called no man's land. There is a space between India and Pakistan which neither falls in the suzerainty or sovereignty of Pakistan or India, no man's land. In the same sense, there is a cusp in astronomy. When a particular planet is transiting from Capricorn to Aquarius, there is a cusp. In the same sense, there is a liminal stage in human society, human life. For example, in case I ask all of you sitting in this class, when you have started feeling strongly that you are not a child, you are adolescent or a youth. Although roughly all of you are of one age group, but in case you are truthfully engaging in a conversation, all your classmates may not give the same exact year when they felt that they are no more youths. अब तुम बच्चे नहीं रहे, अब तुम जवान हो गए. Now you are no more a child, you are almost a youth. This is liminal. When you are neither fully youth nor fully a child. And I am not referring to biological growth of the individual from childhood to adulthood or youthhood. I am referring to cultural construction of youth and childhood. Therefore, in case we have understood rigorously or carefully Durkheimian concept of egoistic suicide, and we are already familiar with Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism by Max Weber, then there are three terms which attracts our attention. One is Weber's emphasis on rationalization. Although he acknowledged that this rationalization usually leads to disenchantment with the world, but his stress on rationality, I mean instrumental rationality, remains intact. Although he talks about the iron cage of bureaucracy, but he asserts again and again that this is the historical tendency which is going to happen to every society, whether you like it or not. And third, he says that rational and legal is better than the non-rational and the non-legal. Now, when Max Weber was criticized vigorously by his contemporaries, then he came up with a new concept in another book, namely the concept of this worldly asceticism. And the book was called Sociology of Religion. And then he wrote a very celebrated article which is included in the prescribed book edited by Gerth and Mills from Max Weber, namely Social Psychology of World Religions. Now let us understand Weber's concept of this worldly asceticism. This worldly asceticism among the Protestant groups, I am making a Durkheimian reading of this worldly asceticism. This is not Max Weber's words and sentences which I am reading out to you. Rather, I am making a Durkheimian reading of this worldly asceticism on the basis of data provided in the book Suicide. This worldly asceticism among the Protestant groups was at best an unverified hypothesis, or at worst an ideological propaganda which had neither empirical basis nor theoretical foundations. In contrast, Protestant groups had greater affinity or logico-historical correlationship with a higher rate of egoistic suicide. From 1902, when the second edition of Durkheim's French book, The Division of Labor in Society, was published, or when Swami Vivekananda of India died, the year is 1902. From 1902 to 2020 or 2021, 22nd of March until yesterday, there were very few capitalists in the world who followed Calvinism in their private or public lives. From 1902 till date means until yesterday, because the data for today cannot be compiled until the sun sets. There were very few capitalists in the world who followed Calvinism in their private or public lives. In contrast, there were more capitalists during the same tenure, same period, who followed the religious and professional ethics of the Jews, Zoroastrian ethics, ethics of the Catholic groups, ethics of the Orthodox churches of Russia, Syria, Egypt and Greece, Chinese religious ethics, Jain religious ethics, Buddhist religious ethics, Sikh religious ethics, and the religious ethics of the Hindu religious denominations. And among these people, there was lower rate of egoistic suicide also. What does it mean? That although In your graduation, in case you opted for sociology as a subject, you are taught that Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism is a classic in sociology. The truth is, at best, it was an unverified hypothesis, or at worst, an ideological propaganda in favor of the newly emerging capitalist class, which had neither empirical basis nor theoretical foundations. Now let me give a pause. Some of you may be thinking that I am against Max Weber and I am in favor of Karl Marx and Émile Durkheim. Yes, I use more Durkheimian sociology than the Marxist sociology or the Weberian sociology, but I do respect Max Weber. When I am reading sociology of law, I take Max Weber as a great classical sociology in the field of law. I also read his book Economy and Society with enthusiasm. But I certainly do not think that Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism is a book which should be taught in any university. First, this book was not a book, it was part of his academic diary, which Weber did not publish. It was published by his disciples, Bhaktas, Chelas. And you know, unlike the masters, including Max Weber, the devotees are much more fanatical, much more fundamentalist. And this is also the case in our country. There are bhaktas of Mahatma Gandhi, there are bhaktas of, B.R. Ambedkar, there are bhaktas of Narendra Modi, there are bhaktas of E.M.S. Namudaripad, there are bhaktas of Ram Manohar Lohia and J.P. Narayan. I have problems with bhaktas, the devotees, who try to respect their teachers by taking their name again and again. But in the process, they insult their masters. Therefore, I do think that the followers of Max Weber did him a lot of harm by promoting this poor book. In case this is a book which represents Max Weber, then Max Weber should not be taught in any university. But this is a wrong idea. Max Weber was truly not an academician, he was truly a politician and a legal luminary, but he had profound books in the field of sociology of law. But that is not taught anywhere in the world, including in our center. And secondly, he had very profound things to share with us regarding the intricate relationship between economic behavior and the beliefs of the individual and groups. Therefore, I read only 2 books of Max Weber, and I think they are not inferior to any book of Émile Durkheim or Das Kapital of Karl Marx. Therefore, I am not against Max Weber. I regard him as a profound scholar of sociology of law. Secondly, he had profound insights to help us grow in sociology of economic life. But I am sorry, his contribution in methodology is hilarious. It entertains you. Max Weber's methodology of social sciences and Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism entertains you like a mindless comedy film made anywhere in the world, including in Hindi cinema. Therefore, do not rubbish Max Weber under the light of my criticism of Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. I am not teaching methodology of social sciences. That is taught in another course, and the teacher is a very celebrated scholar of our center, and I like him. Therefore, please try to understand, that my critique to Max Weber and sometimes my endorsement of Karl Marx is not rooted in my particular sociological views. Rather, I am making those criticism or endorsement under the light of Durkheimian sociology. I think it should be clear to all of you. Now let us come to the second ideology, altruistic suicide. Although time is very short, but at least I will introduce the topic today and take it up tomorrow. What is altruistic suicide? According to Durkheim, where the individual's life is rigorously governed by custom and habit, that is rigorously governed by tradition. In Mechanical Solidarity of Durkheim in the community of tonnage, high suicide rate is either non-existent or it is altogether a different type of suicide, namely altruistic suicide. I am repeating it again. Where the individual's life is rigorously governed by custom and habit, high suicide rate is either non-existent or it is altogether a different type of suicide, namely altruistic suicide. Now, what is altruistic suicide? This type of suicide results from the individual's taking his own life because of higher commandments, either those of religious sacrifice or unthinking political allegiance. Now, in the case of first, that is religious sacrifice, the term in Hindi is Bali or Balidan, and the term in Urdu is Shahadat or Shaheed, and the term in the English language is martyr. Therefore, the common English term martyr or the common Hindi term bali or balidan and the common Urdu term shahadat or shaheed refers to altruistic suicide ideology of Émile Durkheim. Now, unthinking political allegiance. For example, in South India, particularly Tamil Nadu, there are devotees of film stars, come politicians like C.N. Annadurai, the founder of DMK and a very celebrated playwright in Tamil. Also, he was the producer of the film Parasakti, which heralded the growth of Dravidian ideology in Tamil Nadu, and by 1967 it banished the national parties of India out of Tamil Nadu, and it is still continuing. What happens in Tamil Nadu is that when C.N. Annadurai died, his devotees, his staunch followers committed suicide. Then when his successor, the founder of, in Mumbai, that is Bombay. Okay, time is up. I must close.